so much, Joel. Hope everyone is well today. Yeah, it's an honor to be here and to moderate this panel with the founders of BDRB, along with CIMA. And by the way, I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Independent Music Association, aka CIMA, and we teamed up with these two gentlemen last year to develop a series, and which I'm going to let them talk about. And so it is really an honor to be here to talk to you guys. Ian Andre Espinet and David Cox, aka Click. And maybe for the folks who are listening who don't know anything about it, why don't you just give us a sense of how BDRB, breaking down racial barriers, what is it? How did it come to life?
Okay. Who's going to start, Ian, me or you?
Go ahead.
Well, I'll start, but before I start, I really want to acknowledge, I know it was awesome to hear folk music acknowledge what today is. And I think it creeped up on a lot of people in a weird way, but today's an important day, just especially acknowledging Indigenous people and what they've gone through. Even bigger, I think it's even a bigger, for me, what this day means to me is being able to think about what people have gone through in their life, the Indigenous people in this country, even bigger than the children that have been found. It's, it's the land, it's the language, it's everything, and acknowledging that, I think is great that now that there's a day that's doing that. I just wanted to say that because it's important to me, How did this come about? I mean, we've talked about this many times, how BDRB came about. For me, it is a catalyst of different things. Being involved with CIMA and having conversations with, I sit on a committee, the programming committee. And last year when the unfortunate murder of George Floyd happened, it just obviously woke up a lot of people and in different ways. And me and Ian have known each other for a very, very long time. When I worked at B&G Music at a record company, I used to do a lot of parties at his parties. I used to do a lot of release things and advertising and promoting records at his parties. And we've just known each other for a long time and had a great relationship. And one day he called me and was like, listen, we both were kind of upset with the fact that we didn't see our own community speaking up enough. We didn't see enough Black individuals within the music industry speaking about their journey and their voice in regards to what it's like being a Black person working in the music business. And Ian had a lot of the same concerns and really was like, yo, Click, we need to do a roundtable, and he's like, we need a town hall. That's the word that you used, and you said a town hall. And I was like, okay, well, yeah, that's a great idea. But we didn't really jump into it until I went back to CIMA and I said, hey, I actually had a conversation because they were saying, hey, should we have a panel about what's going on? And I was like, oh man, I don't know if it's a panel, yes, there needs to be our voices being heard, but I just don't know what that looks like. But a friend of mine, and we were just talking about this, maybe I could circle back with him and talk about what is needed. And this is really the catalyst of how this started, and I have to give kudos to Ian for the vision of figuring out how to create something that is not performative to the point of just standing on a panel and talking and sharing our traumas and then walking away. It can't be asking a bunch of Black people to come on and talk about their problems and not have solutions. And that's where Declaration and everything else has kind of come to life. You want to add to this, Ian?
Yeah, so as Click said, we had a conversation last year behind the murders of not only George Floyd, that was the final straw that broke the camel's back, but, of course, Freddie Gray and Eric Garner and Alton Sterling and Philando Castile and Ahmaud Arbery and all of the people who were murdered by police officers in the States. And, it was kind of a moment that made the entire world reflect on the treatment of Black people in society and anti-Black racism in all aspects and industries. And the music industry being one where Black people contribute a huge amount of the intellectual property and the creativity and, which, Andrew, you said this in panels that I've seen you on, Black music is the dominant and prevalent music of the world. We really had to have some conversations about the lack of representation and the lack of decision-making and the absence of Black people across the entire ecosystem of the music industry. So that was the catalyst, and what came to be with CIMA and Advanced by our side ended up being a lot more.
Can I just stay on one point here, because I think it's important for people in the sector that the relationship that Black people have with the music industry is particular in a way, and as you say, it's a dominant, like the influence of Black people in the music industry, in music, in the creation of music, the production, the promotion, the style, everything, the entire framework is really influenced and very dominated by Black voices and Black influences in ways that make the exclusion and the racism a much starker. And I think, for me, it seemed like the beginning of this, like the creation of a roundtable, which led to 10 videos discussions, really highlighted and underlined for many people what was actually staring right in their face, which is that, wow, this is an overwhelmingly, a sector overwhelmingly influenced and by Black voices, by the Black community voices. Was that an important thing to really try? I mean, above and beyond the systemic racism, to really was it really important to highlight that, that this was a music industry issue that we needed to deal with?
Definitely. The panels consisted of over 60 working Black professionals from the industry. It was very important that we were able to convey our stories in our own voices authentically without interruption. And the music space is a unique space. I've said in other panels, we talk about sports, and there might be X amount of football players on a field and this number of people in coaching. But in the music industry, we are by and large the majority of the creators of the culture. Whether you're talking about rock or you're talking about folk music, you're talking about hip hop and R&B, which again are the dominant, musics in the world right now. Soul and jazz and, all of these music forms, whether they are dominated currently or not by Black people, many of them and most of them have originated with Black people, and we contribute substantially but aren't in control.
Mm-hmm. And so with the series, what stood out? What surprised you? Did the conversations bring to light things that you didn't expect?
For me, it wasn't so much, it's interesting. It's not so much what surprised me from the conversations, because I've been in the business for almost 30 years. And so I've actually worn a lot of hats in the music business. So I was an artist at the beginning of my career. I worked at record companies. I've promoted concerts. I've worn a lot of different hats. So I've been able to see things in a lot of different lenses. And as a Black person, you can resonate with other people and what is going on, and everything that you've gone through. It is not an eye opener for us. Do you know what I mean? So what was more of a surprise for me, to be honest, was actually hearing from other people. outside of the Black community that I had relationships with for years. Like that's the thing that kind of like surprised me. Like even individuals that maybe I don't ever hear from that would contact me and be like, listen, like to have a president of a major organization contact me that I know, but I never really have a lot of dialogue with, to be like, I'm asking my whole staff to watch this. Like, this is really important to me. And I think there's some major changes that we have not been doing and that we need to start doing. And to hear that was like, whoa, okay. Like I was actually I was surprised. I didn't think that it would resonate the way that it did resonate for me. That was one of the surprises.
For me, I have to echo Click's sentiment. I wasn't surprised by any of it. What I was surprised by was the fact, as Click has stated, that many people frankly didn't realize that there was an issue. I think that the issues that we face in the music industry are both based in systemic, meaning issues that are baked into the fabric of the systems, or systematic issues, which are just de facto things. But oftentimes there are also issues that that come across as racism, which come from systems that were created before we were a part of those systems. So those are the three elements, and so I was really shocked. Didn't know that there was a problem. And the other thing that really shocked me was the fact that so many Black people had internalized the issues to the point where they didn't realize that they were not the causes of those issues. That was something that was pretty shocking to me. And they often had at times had issues articulating the problems that they faced, because it's just been that way for so long, you know.
And I don't know if it's so much a surprise, but more of like more of an excitement, like not excitement, but like I was happy to see so many Black professionals sharing their stories, but also meeting each other. Like there were certain people that had not known about each other. There's certain people that even after the fact, both of us actually have had people come up to us and say they got jobs from this. Like they literally got opportunities from being on these discussions, which was not really something that we thought that's what the purpose was. It wasn't, but just to hear that it had that impact is great.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in the conversation, you guys and the other panelists got pretty deep into the economic barriers, right? And I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit about what that conversation was like, because I know you were talking a bit about, succession and retention and the lack of opportunities and the lack of mentorship, and even speaking about internships and the systemic barriers that are created by those sorts of things, which are used widely in the sector.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, with respect to the economics of it, like these, we speak about issues being systemic, meaning that that they're a part of the systems. Just like cancer, when things are in one area of a system, they're often in other areas as well. So the economic comes from one side and it impacts another. So you have the frankly the loss of income by the lack of representation, the lack of access, and those sorts of things. But it comes in all areas. And so if you're talking about radio, it's the racism that's in the media companies, which leads to ad campaigns not being diverse, which leads to sales reps who say that the products are not for a certain audience, which leads to radio stations that play Black music not receiving revenues. It's in the grant systems and the financial systems like the banks, where there's a lack of representation, which means that there's lack of access to resources for startups of companies and companies that will create infrastructure in the industry. In those same grant and funding systems, which are federal, provincial, and municipal, There's a lack of representation in spaces by decision makers and by grant processes and by the people who create the juries and by the people who create the questions that the juries ask, which means that there's a lower rate of success by Black applicants. There's a lower application rate by Black applicants because the community feels that they are unwelcome or unlikely to be successful. So the economics of it touches everything, but it really, as I said, it stems from lack of representation and access, and this impacts every area of economics, as well as the financial input and output that could be created by the industry had there been greater representation by Black people in the industry.
So you did the 10-part video series, and that led to a process of, kind of filtering and transcribing and doing more research and reflecting on what you'd learned. And that led to, I'm trying to give people a bit of a chronology here, that led to the creation of a declaration that was presented last June. And I'm just wondering if you want to speak a bit about the declaration, why it was important to do, and what was the sort of general outcome of that endeavor.
I'll let Ian break down a little bit of the declaration and the importance, but I will add to the fact that creating something like that where people can all sign on, the idea was to show solidarity with what we're trying to actually get done, and actually give people a voice as at the same time of like, hey, we see what the challenges are, we address what those are, and we are making an effort towards that and kind of pledging to making that difference, right? It doesn't, one thing that's the hardest thing about the declaration is like, you can't really, like, we're not police officers out there, holding everybody to the task. But I think, right now we have 450 signatories on board, and that's a lot. That's pretty amazing, but it's still a lot of people that have not signed that declaration. And so, there's still a lot more work to be done. But I think, Ian, if you could maybe talk about a little bit about like forming that declaration, because a lot of that was your vision in regards to like what needs to be put forward. I think it was really well done. Actually, I'll say one thing. I was on the phone this morning with individual who is running an organization, and he was very thankful for that declaration because he uses that now as framework within his company that he's building, that he runs. And I was just like, that's because he was like, before that I was like, oh, we need to do something, I just don't know what is the right thing, and I don't know what is the steps. And he says that was like everything. Like, I was sitting literally asking somebody else, how do we do this? And then all of a sudden this came out, and I was like, oh my God, this is perfect. And he's used that as his framework.
Amazing. So the goal of the declaration was to was multifaceted. It was, we undertook this 10-part panel discussion with CIMA, and as you said, Andrew, across those 10 weeks, we came to a lot of realizations from the the things that people were saying in these panels about cultural appropriation and about self-determination and about representation and access and funding and the problems faced by artists, etc. And so, on the 1-year anniversary of Blackout Tuesday, where the whole industry came together to say that they were on board to stamp out anti-Black racism in the music industry, we decided that we would keep the conversation going, and that it was very important because, especially in times of COVID, companies are trying to stay in business, and everybody's trying to survive. It's very easy for issues like this to be swept under the table and go back to normalcy, or what is deemed as normalcy. So we created this declaration, and the declaration basically had 7 key tenets, and And it was, and I can't go into them in detail, but you can read them at www.bdrb.ca. But we wanted companies to start where they were and work towards the goal of creating an equitable workspace. And so we were asking them for to work on the creation of anti-Black racism policies and training for their staff that would, would create a more reasonable workspace where people felt safe and were able to be themselves. Work with professionals on their policies, etc., and to see where they have spots that are barriers to progress of Black music professionals. We talked about the collection of key metrics and race-based data. Data is such a critical thing because if you don't know what's going on, you can't figure out the scope and intensity of the problem, right? So we talked about companies, collecting data, trying to figure out the percentage of Black employees that they had, et cetera, et cetera. And then we talked about things like representation throughout the music industry ecosystem, your hiring practices, your HR departments, the ways that you look at the way that you hire people. And this is simple stuff like putting in, a statement that you're welcoming to a diverse workforce in your employment. To retention, things like retention, which is what are you doing for your staff to ensure that they can get to the next level, that they don't just hit a glass ceiling and quit and leave the industry, or like what we see in music in Canada generally, which is that people leave and go to the States, right? So, we talked about retention and succession in there. And then, things like boards and makeup of your company, look around your company. Do you see any Black people at all? Look at your board. If it's all 70-year-old white men, then you may have a problem, these kind of things. And then just you're looking at your company, your investments, your partnerships, your RFPs. Do you have any Black companies in your, do you know, simple things like festivals? Do you have a Black photographer? Do you have, are you open to these things? Graphic designers, accountants, lawyers, publishers, you know what I mean? So these were the things that we put in the declaration, and this is a lot more detailed. But as Click said, it can provide a very, very base roadmap. Click is what you use, roadmap for things that you can implement in your companies, no matter what the size is, whether you're 1 to 5 or 5 to 25 or 50 to 100, or you're the big record labels and ticket masters and those kind of companies.
Yeah, I think for a lot of members of CIMA and for frankly the majority of people in the music industry are small scale businesses, one person operations at some in many instances, and they're contracting services. I know that there hasn't been traditionally resources for those types of businesses. I mean, there's been a lot of focus on HR, and of course, many of our companies don't have an HR department, right? So the declaration is very helpful for those people, and I think it's one of the many really important things about this is that it can speak to companies and individuals in the music space wherever they are and whatever their point of entry and their where they're standing. And I think that's been super important, and we're getting that feedback as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a type of a success. But let's talk a bit about your feelings now, many months later, about where we're at with this declaration, and where we need to go. So yeah, go ahead.
I feel that where we need to go is, me and Ian have had many conversations about how to support people moving forward, right? And these are some of the things that BDRB are currently working on and putting into place. We've had some great conversations with different shareholders and individuals in the industry who want to see the actions that we're trying to put out there come to fruition. And a lot of that comes down to consulting, helping people with their D&I. But another element that I really would like to do is get out there and really continue the push in areas that I'm not seeing. So for me, I feel like, just to be frank and be honest here, I feel like the media side of the music business is such a huge entity that music is sometimes not putting on the priority list compared to other things that matter to them. Let's say it could be we're in the TV business, or we're in the newspaper media. We're not, music is just the small part, so they don't give it the attention it needs, and they use it as an excuse. And I think that based on the fact that there's a high lack of declaration signing from radio stations, from media outlets, is an exact reflection of that. And I would like to see more of them take this a lot more seriously, because they're continuing the exact same problem that we've been talking about. They're continuing to be blinded to the fact that there's a lack of diversity, and that they are continuing the systematic racism and systemic racism that exists within their organizations by not acknowledging this and actually doing something about it. You know, that's part of it. From like, when you ask like how I feel about the declaration, for me, that's where I see I don't see a huge hands up. I want to make a difference there. That's just me.
Yeah, I would take it a step further to say that it's willful blindness in some spaces. The live music space is a terribly inequitable space, whether it be sponsorship or just getting venues or the perception of the music, etc. A lot of these spaces have and have been performative, and as we sit here on the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, performative is like, sadly, when we talk about performative action, like we have a day of reconciliation that only 3 provinces have ratified. You know what I mean? Like it's these kind of performative actions that have members of, I don't even want to call them, marginalized communities, like systemically excluded communities, feeling the way that they do, because like they put up black squares and they say these things and whatever the case is. But like, I think for me it's a year later, and a lot of people are really trying. A lot of people are really making a lot of effort, but there has been, and we, myself and yourself, Andrew, have spoken about this. There has to be an effort to not just do things that look good, but do things that actually make change. And so, this is not a 1-year project. This is not a 5-year project. This is an ongoing project, and nobody expects anyone to get it correct at the beginning. However, a lot of companies will sign something like a declaration and move on. And so, we've been quiet for a little while because we've been putting a lot of infrastructure in place for the support of these companies. And we do recognize that a lot of these companies do not have the resources necessary to hire consultants, etc. And so, the goal of CIMA and BDRB is to try to make change at a system level, in assistance and receive assistance from government, and changes in policies and things of those sorts, as well as lobbying for money that can be provided to small companies for them to do this work, as they would if they were putting in a washroom for the differently abled, or et cetera, et cetera.
And you mentioned government and policy, and I just wanted to just pick out one thing around the whole, about the live sector, and the barriers in this, just with regard to even city bylaws and permitting. And I think a lot may not realize that there's those levels of barriers to Black artists and Black entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, like in the festival space, that we'll speak about a lot, and Click can speak more to this. Like you have artists from all genres who are not booked. There's a lack of agents. Like Click, I mean, maybe you want to touch on this quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's a need, like representation is a huge part that was brought up and is consistently brought up, and a lot of it's because it helps to have somebody who's from the culture, who's from the community, who sees things through the same lens that you see things through, and also has an actual emotional connection to something, to get behind something sometimes, especially when something is still a seed and not a tree. Most people will jump on board when it's a tree and there's apples to pick from it because they can see it and it's like, oh yes, this is great, I'll jump on this bandwagon. That's what I call it. But when something is growing, especially in this country where there's a lack of infrastructure that has traditionally supported Black artists, it's hard to get like an agent or a promoter or anybody to give it the right attention unless that is already blown up. But it's different when you have somebody who comes from has representation there because they now understand the plight that needs to be put in. And so I've always felt like, why isn't there more people from different cultures within organizations who actually are part of the community that actually can fight for what we're trying to achieve? And that's still something that still does not exist in this business, like in Canada, like what Ian's talking about. There's a real lack of representation. And even when you bring it, like, it's funny because a lot of people, like when I used to work at the record companies, and I was an A&R guy. So I'd go out and I would see artists all the time that I was a huge fan of. But I knew that I couldn't sign them, just to be frank. Like I was like, listen, there's no infrastructure for me to back up what I'm like. I feel like I would sign you and it might not work because there's no support. There's no radio stations that's going to play you. There's no, there are all these things in place. So I have to find something that actually works in the marketplace, which was very challenging. But I think like this all comes back to the lack of representation in spaces.
Are you going to add something in there?
Yeah, and just with respect to the live space, like, I mean, a lot of this isn't rocket science, right? Like, some of this is like, it's just the conscious and unconscious biases that people have. They don't know any Black people. They watch television, and again, due to the lack of representation in creatives and creators and producers and editors and directors, etc. As long as the lion doesn't tell his own story, the hunter will always be the hero, right? So when you turn on Netflix, using an example, and every story is about a Black guy trying to escape the ghetto, and you have a music executive who's never come into contact with any Black people, then his understanding is that all Black people are thugs or are criminals or whatever the case may be, as represented by media that is not created by Black people. And consequently, you have people telling me things like, oh, you're really eloquent for a Black person. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm like, I was born and raised in Canada just like you, like, you know what I mean? So it's like, and these things trickle down. They trickle down into everything. They trickle down into the attitudes of club owners and venue owners who are concerned about violence coming from certain music. They're concerned with the audience, and their attitudes, etc. But they've never, and I've been through every single major venue in this country throwing concerts and, all the way to 10,000 and 15,000 venues. And what comes into play is that they're like, oh, you know what? The audience was really nice. And they were, the bartenders loved it. And our staff had a great time and they were really polite. And, you know, like, they just really want to have a good time just like us. And I'm like, yeah. Just
What
like
did you think it was?
you know what I mean? So yeah, those things trickle down, and they're in the, you know, like, again, these issues are systemic. You see them in policing. You know, like, you see the over policing of Black events. You know, in my early years, I was required to get twice to three times as much pay duty for concerts as other promoters, twice to three times as much security. You had venues that told us that, you know, in the 90s and the mid early 2000s, that their liquor license had restrictions against the playing of certain types of music, such as reggae or hip hop or etc. Right? So, you know, these things are baked in, as I said, and they come from the attitudes of the individuals who make the decisions in those organizations and spaces.
And I'll add that is also a level of conditioning that, you know, people have in their own psyche that unfortunately has been uh, embedded in their brains from television and stereotypical things that we all grow up watching and hearing. And then it also comes from gatekeepers still pushing the same thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, if there's a reason why you don't see a lot of females in rock and roll, and then to see even Black people doing rock and roll, to hear in those spaces, because I believe a lot of these spaces are conditioned to think that it's a certain way. You know, I had a conversation with Gary Clark Jr., you know, amazing guitar player. And I was talking to him about blues festivals, and he was upset. He's like, yeah, I can't stand some of these blues festivals because they want to police what they believe and what they're conditioned to think blues is supposed to sound like.
Look like
If I bring in an experiment with the blues, he's like, I'm the blues. I come from the blues. We created the blues. So now you're gonna tell me what the blues is not? Do you know what I mean? And so that's something that's really like disheartening as an artist manager, working with artists who are pushing the meter and doing something different, just to be told that what you're doing is not satisfactory to what they're conditioned to believe something should sound like.
So you went from a series which resulted in not just a declaration, but it also resulted in the first of two reports, one of which you've completed. And there's some recommendations in there, and I wanted to know if you could just speak to some of those key findings in that first volume.
Yeah, so you know, we went from, as you said, the 10-part discussion, which opened up the eyes of the industry. Like, I think 22,000 people watched it, to the declaration, which is now signed by 450. If you haven't signed it, please. We are going to embark on a new campaign to get more on board. And then there's volume 1 of the report, you know, which brought to fruition like a few key understandings. And these are things that, like, before I go into like key recommendations, that I think that it's important that everybody who's watching understand. And one of those things is that the Black community is not homogenous. And so, like, it's not a one size fit all. And these are understandings that we have to understand and communicate before we even get into further work. So we're not all the same. Not one Black person equals another Black person, one size fits all in terms of the answer, because Black people came to Canada in different ways. Some were forced here through slavery. Some came across in the U.S. wars. Some came in immigration waves like the Caribbean and the Africans in the 2000s. And Black issues. We're speaking about Black music and the music industry. They require Black focused solutions, not BIPOC solutions, not solutions for people of color. They need solutions that are specific to the Black community, because the issues that Black people face in the music industry are unique. And you know, it's critical that we call things what they are. It's critical that we call this racism. We don't call it, you know, discrimination or mistreatment or any of these things. We have to identify what these things are so that we can fix them. And it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, and we're going to have like some, some conversations that like, and people are going to make mistakes, but this is what has to happen in order for us to have the honest conversation to fix the issues. And it just comes through communication. And then, basically, as I said before, we talked about, training and the need for representation. And so there has to be changes in policies, like the way that companies recruit, the way that they hire, the consideration of things like open hiring, where you realize that certain people might be excluded because of certain barriers that they face. You don't think about, Andrew, you spoke about this earlier. You were talking about internships. If you're rich and your parents pay your way through university, et cetera, you may be able to take an unpaid internship for an entire summer. However, if you don't have the resources, if you don't start at the same starting, you might not be able to work in a record label free for a whole summer because you need to save money to go to university. So it's like these kind of barriers. So it's like looking at your recruitment and hiring practices. Maybe considering cluster hiring or voluntary submission of like, industry positions to like ad boards so that you can recruit a wider range of people, as opposed to just putting it out and there's like, like we talk about this all the time. The industry has a lot of nepotism. It's not, you know what I mean? The creation of mentorship programs, internships, and this is where allyship, like with like CIMA and a lot of the organizations and companies like Folk Music Ontario, by doing these kind of panels and giving voice and creating space for people who don't otherwise get to speak, and then just things like retention and succession practices, like tracking why your Black employees are leaving, tracking how many you have, developing a work culture that makes people feel safe, being intentional about about providing access to information to your staff. Like, over the last 20 years, we've seen huge advances for women in the industry, where there are, things like key change and programs that provide mentorship for women by men in the industry or by other successful women. Are there similar things for individuals from communities who have been marginalized, like the Black community, who don't have access? You know what I mean? How do you create a company that's the size of Live Nation when you're my size? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what are these, like, how do you, like, I wouldn't even know where to start, but with mentorship from allies who have done it or others, so these are kind of things, the opening up of your boards and your executive roles, community consultation for all, issues, like you're creating policies. Have you spoken to any Black people, or are you just deciding what you think that they need from your perspective? So we got a lot of recommendations in all of those areas, and a lot, for the government in terms of things that they should put into play in order for people to get their grants. And so we are working consistently on the ground level with small companies and organizations. And we are, as you said, Andrew, working diligently to get out volume 2. And then the real work starts now, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I'll just take a moment here just to I'll say that today being a day where we remember the history of colonialism and the effects of that on Indigenous people, particularly with regards to residential schools. There has been sort of a wide call throughout the country to take a moment of silence at 2:15. Remember the 215, the remains of 215 kids, Indigenous kids in Kamloops. We're going to take that moment of silence right now. Okay, thank you. I wanted to let folks know who are watching this that if you have a question for Ian or Click, you can put it in the chat, and we can take it from there. So please don't be shy. Just send them along. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of what are the I guess some of the most challenging initiatives and most challenging kind of first steps, I guess, that companies are faced with, and individuals and organizations when sort of taking the step from signing the declaration to action.
I'll add one, and then Ian, you can bounce the ball back. I think one would be the data. I think, unfortunately, some people find it very challenging to provide data to other people that are looking for it, that can help make those changes or implement changes to back it up. So like if we had all the information in regards to like how many Black employees are there, what is the pay, what is the, all these things really help paint the picture when it comes time to getting support where needed. And part of that challenge sometimes is outreach and the challenges that are faced with asking for it. Even when, for example, talking to somebody earlier this week, they've created a survey to go to the community, the Black community specifically, to get some data, and they're having a really hard time getting people to fill out that survey. And I say, well, some of that's probably because there's maybe a mistrust, like Ian was talking about, or there's something where they feel like, is this just somebody doing something performative, or like, what's the real results of this? Because there's been an ongoing history of not supporting things properly, and don't feel like that just because you're doing that now, all of a sudden something's going to change. Some people want to see the changes happen like this because they're just tired of it. So some of the challenges is that, and I think that how that has to be rectified is you need to have, back to the representation part, is having somebody who can really speak on your behalf and really go and hire people to go into the communities to actually make the right connection, so that people want to get involved with whatever initiatives that you're trying to implement. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I find that and I spoke to this like briefly, the access to resources to do the work. Signing declarations is not the work, and but it is a great start. Don't allow me to be remiss, but a lot of small companies, as I said, are struggling to survive COVID and the pandemic, and consequently don't have money. Like we talked about this, they don't have HR departments, they don't have, they're 1 to 5 or 5 to 10 person organizations, and consequently I think there's a need by us and our allies and associates like CIMA to push on government who is committed to making these changes, to creating resources and allocating finance to companies for them to apply for funds to get consultants or assistance that they need in order to make these changes. I think that would be my primary area that I think is challenging small companies, especially,
Mm-hmm.
and small organizations.
And do you feel like in this year, when you reflect on it, do you feel like the needle has moved?
I think that there's been a lot of movement, but I don't know if there's been a lot of change. There have been a lot of Black people moving around the industry. There have been individual successes, and we don't want to take any of that away, by people who probably should have been in positions years ago.
Yeah.
People who were, marketing managers who are now directors who should have been directors 5 years ago. There have been changes to, in the grant systems, for sure, at the federal and the provincial levels with Factor and with Ontario Creates and a lot of these spaces. But a lot of these organizations, a lot of the arts councils still have not changed their lens to give the same sort of respect to Black music forms and Black culture forms as they do to, traditional European dance forms like ballet, or art like, Group of Seven, or, like music, like certain, and there has been a lot of tokenism. Like there are examples of artists who will be paraded as success, but oftentimes, like you're seeing the same people on the panels, the one Black person we know. You're seeing a lot of panels on diversity and a lot of panels with a whole group of Black people, but not diversity in the rest of the panels in conferences. One Black person popping up on a festival, but not like people in lighting where they're hiring or in other spaces. And so I think that there's been a lot of movement. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that companies have felt the need to do things that they can show outwardly quickly. But like showing something quickly does not equal, and for the purpose of performance doesn't mean change necessarily, but there has been change, but I think there's just been a lot of movement.
Yeah, I think that definitely certain companies have kind of like stepped up really fast to like, oh yeah, I want to make a difference. But I think that some of the choices that they've made have kind of backfired a little bit too. I've seen certain people put certain people on bills that don't match what the actual bill is, just for the performative nature. But then at the same time, I have seen and I've heard from companies that are definitely trying to make a difference, and by doing that, they're actually reaching out to different people within the community to help make that difference with them, and actually really being proactive in it. And that's like amazing examples of how it should be done, and I have to give credit to also just there's a lot of people on the ground that are really doing the work. I don't want to not say that that's not happening, because even having an organization like Advance that exists now in the way that they're moving, there's another organization, and I'm seeing other organizations across the country that have been being built up, and a lot of that is a catalyst of everything that everybody's doing together. And I like to think about like what everything's going to look like in 5 years.
Yeah, and there are, like, again, I don't want to be remiss and say that there are a lot of and I've been reluctant always to use the word allies, but there are a lot of individuals at the heads of organizations, especially organizations, who are really trying to implement change. There are a lot of people who, like, again, not everything is racism. Sometimes some people just don't know how. So there are a lot of people who are calling and ask questions, read, Google, you know what I mean? Call. But yeah, like there has been significant, the conversation is the critical piece, and opening these conversations is the critical piece. And everybody doesn't know everything, but if you don't, try and find somebody who does. Just reach out, LinkedIn, etc.
So in the last few minutes here of our conversation, thank you both for the time today. Just wondering, so where does BDRB go from here? What's the next steps for the two of you and this? I think you've been pretty busy with this, right? And maybe more than, yeah, it's been a busy time, and you're both also, in the business too, and working on that as well. So like, where does this go from here?
So I mean, presently we are in addition to things like this, we are working with ECMA, the East Coast Music Association, and the MIAs out in the East Coast. Episode 4, the final episode of the BDRB ECMA, will take place at the Nova Scotia Music Week. And off of that will stem volume 3 of the report. We are also working on some other initiatives on the other side of the country presently. But most importantly, we are creating resources that can be utilized by small businesses. And because, like the majority of the industry is that will go on the website that small companies can access, such as consultants that they can get in touch with, and just things that they can do. If you are not on the mailing list, join the mailing list. We send out, starting tomorrow, we start out monthly emails that will have like tidbits of things, 10 things that you can do around your company, and those kind of things. And we are open to consultation and referral to consultants in the DEI space. And we will be working with CIMA and of course Advance. If you have jobs, put them on Advance's job board, et cetera, et cetera.
Click, do you have anything to add to that agenda?
I mean, I think Ian really touched it. I think, I think some of the other things that we've talked about is like really trying to like, I don't want to say survey, but like at least keep track of like what progress has happened within organizations and spaces, and trying to help those organizations get to a next level, and I think we've also talked, I think, let's manifest some idea. Like we've had some really great ideas in terms of creating even events that are centered around what we're trying to achieve here that might help with bringing different people together. And I think that I would love to see it go even farther than like Canada. Like I would love to bring in people from Australia, people from Europe, people from South America, people from the US to come and talk about initiatives that are happening in other territories and how that is actually affecting their industry, and kind of making a symposium of what we're trying to achieve,
That's I think a great way to maybe wrap this up today. Ian, you want to say one more thing before we hit the 2:30 mark?
Log on to www.bdrb.ca. Read, sign, and share the declaration. It is hosted on the CIMA website. Read, sign, and share. And if you haven't signed, please do so, and look out for BDRB coming, volume 1, 2, and 3 coming soon.
I also like to, before we leave, I also like to thank you, Andrew. Andrew came to moderating this very at the last minute. We really appreciate you for that. And I also just want to acknowledge, like, you're new to CIMA as of, well, you're not new anymore, but I mean, you came into our initiative, from the outskirts, and really I want to acknowledge your, I think the way that you approached and worked with us to achieve what we wanted to achieve is appreciated by us. That's what I want to say, and I think that the initiatives and the work that you're doing and what you've been taking from the baton that we're passing on with what you're doing with CIMA, because I'm on the board, so I see what we're doing over there, is also another example of what I would like to see other organizations do. So thank you for that.
And thank you to Folk Music Ontario for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.